Good morning. I'm interviewing Phyllis Loonsfoot, who is currently the director of the Women's Center in Marquette, Michigan. We are speaking in March of 2014. Phyllis will give us an overall view of her own chronology in relationship to the Women's Center and her own career, and then describe some of the programs and things that have happened throughout the years that she has particular insight with. Welcome, Phyllis.
Thank you, Jane.
Would you like to begin with your own history here?
Yes. My history with the Women's Center began in probably about 1986. It was right around the mid-'80s, right after the Women's Center took over administration of the shelter. I began as a volunteer. My introduction to this organization was, I was at that time working for the Head Start program. And I was working with a family, a battered woman who ended up staying at the shelter. And I went to talk with her while she was there, and I met the director at that time. And she was pretty excited about me becoming a volunteer and called me a few times. And then I finally, found the time to go down and meet with her and talk with her. And then I became a volunteer. I volunteered for a good number of years into the mid-'90s.
What types of things would you do as a volunteer?
As a volunteer, I would go in and provide shift coverage. They had a different staffing structure back at that point in time, and they had what they called live-in night managers, which were northern students that would, in lieu of room and board, they would provide that 24/7 piece overnight to save the organization money. And I would oftentimes come in and relieve them for an early morning shift or cover part of a late shift to answer crisis phones and to work with the women and children in the shelter. I also was a member of their DVAT team. That was the Domestic Violence Advocacy Team. And that was an on-call rotation where you carried a pager. And when the call came in from a hospital or a police department, a domestic violence assault had taken place, they would contact a DVAT member, and I would, go out in the middle of the night and go to the hospital and provide those services to survivors.
Supporting
them through the process of the examination and the law enforcement interview.
Okay. And then the volunteering led to?
Well, the volunteering led to, my husband and I left the area for a few short years, and I worked for actually a different domestic violence program while I was downstate for a tribe downstate. And then when I came back to the area, they had a position vacancy for a court advocate. The Women's Center had just been awarded a CDC grant.
CDC?
Center for Disease Control. They did a pilot program, and the Women's Center was one of the few programs that was selected.
Was this a state program or a national program?
I think it was a national program. There were very few organizations that were selected, and the Women's Center was one of them. So I think that's speaks volumes about the Women's Center's reputation, even at the national level. So I was hired at that point in time to serve as a court advocate. That position transitioned into the DVAT coordinator, and I coordinated the volunteers that would go out and respond to these domestic violence situations. And I only did that for a short period of time, and then that worked into being promoted to the shelter director at the Harbor House.
Do you recall what year that would have been?
That was probably right around either 2000 or 2001.
So you were still in the first location of the shelter?
Yes, the original location of the shelter. And that's back in the day when the shelter was not a known location, was not a known entity, and it was shrouded in all kinds of secrecy and things of that nature.
Which strikes us now as a little strange with the openness. On the other hand, it was felt to be protective of the women or the men who were being sheltered at the time.
Right, and that was the train of thought at that point in time. But then as time progressed and marched on, we started evolving in our thinking at the local level, as well as some, organizations at the state level, that, we started having conversations, why are we hiding battered women? They should not be hiding. They don't have any reason to hide. They don't have anything to feel ashamed of, because they have been victimized. So then we started having conversations about changing that. And that came about when we moved the location to the new place where we're at right now.
I don't want to go too far afield on this, but was that also a trade-off because there might still be fear that a victim, that the spouse or the person involved in victimizing them might show up at the doorstep? Was there that kind of concern or
Well, that was actually happening when we were a secret.
Anyway.
When our location was secret. There were times when that would happen anyway. And then, you know, we safety plan with Better Women, we safety plan as a staff, we safety plan, you know, as an organization. Just by the very nature of the work that we do, that's just something that we're very proficient at and we're very aware of and cognizant of. We just do safety planning on multiple levels. You know, even when leaving the building at night, you know, we always have to be aware, you know, of what our surroundings are. And I think that just is part and parcel for a lot of women anyway, but we just ramp that up a lot.
you're not just leaving the grocery store?
Right, exactly.
All right, so you moved on. You were working primarily with the Harbor House aspect, or I realize from a previous interview they're combined, but I think in some people's mind Harbor House is distinct from the Women's Center. Can you describe that?
That's kind of a complicated thing. When I first began my employment, and even I can, you know, reach back to the days when I was a volunteer, there seemed to be that distinction, even within the organization itself, that the Women's Center, you know, was a separate entity from the shelter. And I think that might date back to historically, I think, you know, from what I've been told by talking to our founding mothers and other people in the community, back in the late 1970s, that's when sheltering battered women began. And when that began, it was happening. Women in the community were opening up their homes to other battered women to bring them in, you know, and they were serving as refuge, as a safe haven for, you know, battered women in the community. And then I believe it was sometime in the early 80s when the Spouse Abuse Shelter Board Incorporated became a nonprofit 501c3, and they actually opened Harbor House as a domestic violence shelter as a separate entity within the community. And I think that that may lend itself, and still maybe to this day, to some community members, you know, being aware of that and that there being that distinction of the two separate entities. And back in 1986, the Women's Center, you know, had been established as a nonprofit for about 6 years. And they received a call from the Domestic Violence Prevention and Treatment Board asking them, the Women's Center, to take over administration of the shelter because there were some things that were happening that they were considering having to close the shelter if the Women's Center would not agree to take the program on.
So the state level was saying
at the
you better
level.
do it. Oh.
Mm-hmm. Well, they were saying if you know, are not in agreement with this, then we might have to close the shelter. So the Women's Center, you know, took that on, and the Spouse Abuse Shelter Board did dissolve some years later. But since 1986, the shelter has been a Women's Center program. And I think that lent itself to some separateness, even within the organization. You know, it only makes sense to me that that would happen. But we've worked long and hard, you know, to bring everything together and integrate everything. But I think there's still some residual thoughts out in the community.
And the board, so there's one board that oversees both.
There is one board now. The Harbor House is a Women's Center program. And I think internally it even took a little bit of time for that integration to happen.
Right. I remember one interviewee, see if this is what you recall, said one of the issues was that the fundraising from bingo was very important to the Women's Center, substantial amounts of money, but you could only have one organization, so that you had to keep some distinction between the two so that Harbor House could have a bingo game, and so it was a very practical contributing to this sense of separation. So that's accurate?
And that is accurate.
Okay.
And I think another contributing factor was the fact before the Spouse Abuse Shelter Board dissolved, they did specific fundraising only for the Harbor House domestic violence shelter. The two boards never really integrated, and I'm not sure of what the history is there, but they, at that point in time, were doing specific fundraisers just for the shelter. So that lent itself, again, to that separateness.
So we need to think about them being integrated. And you oversee, in your role now as CEO, do you oversee both
Yes.
programs?
Yes.
I mean, I'm misspeaking too. The program of the Women's Center
Yes, I
Harbor.
do. We also have a satellite office in Alger County, and that's part of us as well. We have one advocate that provides domestic and sexual violence services. She's the Lone Ranger in Alger County, bless her heart, and she holds down the fort there and provides all those services.
I do remember that early in 2000, several of the programs in outreaching in communities, was there one in Ishpeming?
Yes, we did.
You've had to pull in because of funding issues.
We have had to downsize some of that programming. We were able to maintain the programming in Alger County, but we did have to downsize it. We did have 2 advocates there. One was a domestic violence advocate and one was a sexual assault advocate. So now we have one advocate there and have consolidated those services. And she, had been cross-trained to provide both of those services. But the Ishpeming satellite office, that did have to close.
Okay. Now, have we touched on your career path enough that then you can go back? You want to make some comments on the general history?
I do. I do, and the Women's Center has a very rich history, and it dates back to the 1960s, and I'm just in awe of that whole movement and how it all came to be. It's starting off as a group of concerned community members getting together in each other's basements and living rooms and dining room tables, just talking about women's rights and equality and all of those things, and just thinking about how things have evolved over the course of time into where we are today. It's phenomenal. It's amazing to me, and it's an honor to be a part of this process. It really, really is. Beginning right before my employment, I was still in touch and in tune with what was happening with this organization, and I'm going to refer to my notes, and I think it was back in about 1995 or 1996. The Women's Center started thinking about coordinating services and collaborating with the prosecutor's office and local law enforcement. Those were about the time when, the Women's Center was thinking about, rights for survivors of domestic violence within the judiciary system and the whole law enforcement response effort as it trickled through the prosecutor's office on up into the courtroom. And so the Women's Center was really focusing on, starting the conversations at that level and talking about, and I think statewide and maybe even nationwide, there's buzz lingo within every profession, and community coordinated response efforts that started to be the main topic of conversation, and bringing all the players to the table to talk about how can we work together as a team, to create that safety net for survivors of domestic and sexual violence and promote offender accountability. And it takes, multi-systems involved in that process. And
would you comment, and you wouldn't be the first, but that was perceived that the response was inadequate at these different levels in most communities?
Well, and I think the domestic violence movement was in its infancy, if you will, at that point in time, and had been, not considered to be a criminal matter at that point in time. And things were just starting to evolve in that respect. And some laws were beginning to be put into place to protect battered women. I can remember back in the mid-'80s, responding as the DVAT volunteer. I got called in one time to go with a survivor of domestic violence to transport her to a local police department within the community. And stop in there.
Resume the conversation with Phylis Loonsfoot. We had to record this on a new memory card. Phylis was describing the situation with law enforcement and domestic assaults.
Yes, and what that looked like back in the day, in the mid to late 80s and even early 90s, as the domestic violence movement was getting off the ground and gaining some speed, was I had gotten called in as a DVET volunteer to transport a survivor of domestic violence to a local police department to meet up with a law enforcement officer who was then going to follow us and provide a standby, just as a peacekeeper, so she could get, emergency belongings, clothing, medications, and things of that nature. And this was a pretty common response back in that era of time. I walked into the law enforcement department with her, and the officer at the front desk obviously recognized her, and he took one look at her and he said to her, "What did you do to make him angry this time?" And that was pretty much the mindset back in that time frame. So being the strong advocate and the feminist that I am, I believe I was born a feminist, I have to check myself before I respond sometimes. And what I did at that moment was I asked her just to wait outside by the car. And I spoke a few words to the officer at the desk about what my thoughts were about that comment to her, and informed him that I would be waiting outside with her. It was within a very short time span, maybe a minute or two, when another officer came out of the department and approached, and he wanted to talk to me, and he wanted to apologize to me. And I said, "You don't owe me an apology. You owe her an apology. So if you came out here to make an apology, my hope is that you would have this conversation with her." And so he did. So, those are the, some of the things that was happening across the board. Not only with law enforcement, but at, different junctures within that criminal justice system, because they weren't moving as progressively as the Women's Center was in this respect. So that was all part and parcel, and that was the beginning of, the conversations of starting this whole, collaborative efforts and developing a community coordinated response. And believe me, that did not happen overnight. That took almost a decade.
Do you give a lot of credit to the Women's Center and people in it for working that through and cooperating? And when you talk about a coordinated response, what agencies might be included in that?
Oh, a community coordinated response involves, multiple agencies. Sometimes the beginning point for addressing a domestic violence situation, it might happen at the emergency room at the hospital. So then they would, be included in that collaborative effort. Law enforcement, absolutely, in every juncture within the criminal justice system, including the prosecutor's office and the judges in the courtroom, and even probation officers and other people throughout the whole entire justice system. It involves, because battered women have multiple needs, it involves establishing those types of working relationships with the Department of Human Services, because they have financial needs, and developing those relationships with local attorneys, because there are obviously sometimes issues with needing a divorce or child custody matters or things of that nature.
Did all of these folks get together around a table on occasions, or did the Women's Center work with them in small groups?
Well, what happened about 1995 or 1996, those conversations evolved to the degree the Women's Center was really trying to put forth an effort to coordinate with the prosecutor's office at that point in time. And the formation of the Marquette County Domestic Violence Coalition was the result of those conversations, which brought all those players to the table. And those were the beginning days of the conversations about, working together cooperatively and collaboratively, to keep survivors safe and hold offenders accountable. And what could we do as a team? Because, none of these entities, not even the Women's Center, none of us could do this alone. It requires a community effort. The Women's Center is a community-based program, so we place significant value on maintaining it, establishing and maintaining those community relationships. They're so important.
And to have some consistency among them in terms of the way they handled
Absolutely.
the situation of a woman or a man being abused.
Absolutely. Yeah. The beginning of the process was a little bit rocky. The relationships were a little bit contentious because, there were some steadfast belief systems, and within other organizations. And the Women's Center, of course, was very steadfast in their belief system. that brought about some very intense conversations sometimes when we came to the table to try to, work these things out. And it took a decade for it all to be, ironed out and smooth. And today, the collaborative partnerships that we have, what I can say about that is we're looked at as a leader and a role model in that respect. Even to this day, when I travel to, to go to meetings in Lansing or, conferences and in other places, I hear other directors and other advocates talking about the non-existence of these types of working relationships, even to this day. So, this organization, and I feel honored to be a part of that process because I feel it's so important to, we have evolved to being one of the leaders in that respect.
So people are looking to you, and then the success of it, I think, speaks for itself. Women's lives have been changed and saved.
Absolutely. Back in the day, in the early 90s and even in the mid-90s, we weren't able to call up another organization and advocate as effectively on behalf of survivors as we are today.
And it took a cultural shift. I think we've alluded to that in other interviews, that part of the reason it took 10 years is it takes that long for people to educate one another about the issues involved.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it stems back to social norms, what was acceptable, across the span of time, and you arrive at a certain juncture and whoa, there's this new concept out there. And it takes, a little bit of time to bring that kind of change about. It just doesn't happen overnight. And I think it speaks to if you, live your life primarily with a certain core belief and a value, and all of a sudden you're being exposed to a whole different way of thinking. Change is difficult. Doesn't happen overnight. So.
And my perception from these interviews is the Women's Center has been consistent and a catalyst, sticking to core values, but willing to look at the other points of view and involve people.
Absolutely. And if you look at the foundation of which the Women's Center was built on, it was all about equality, and it was all about women's rights and equality for all people and propelling people forward and, believing in justice and all of those things. That is such a secure foundation to build upon. And it's been what's propelled us forward. We believe in what we do to the core of our being, and that's why we're here.
Great. Now, could you discuss here in 2014, just give us an overview, a new person coming in, how you do operate? A little bit about the board, about your job, the various programs.
I want to back that up just a couple of years.
Sure.
The Women's Center has gone through some pretty tumultuous times with funding and in other respects. And it has a lot to do with, the whole national climate, who's in office and what money's available. And there are things that happen that divert monies in other directions. So back in 2010, when I first sat in this seat, we were facing some budget cuts, significant budget cuts. And at that point in time, this organization laid off about 5 staff members, which kind of, changed how we operated at that point in time. There were some other things happening administratively, and so many significant cuts had been made. I had been working as the shelter director, and some other changes were happening, over here administratively. The board at that time, the Women's Center board, consolidated, the executive director position, the program director position, the shelter director position, and whatever other pieces from other layoffs had happened, office manager pieces and things, all got consolidated into one position, and I became the director of this organization as appointed by the board. The longtime finance director, who had been here for a long time, was due to retire. So there was a lot of transition going on, and it was all about stabilizing at that point in time. and not even looking around about expanding programming.
Surviving.
Surviving. Just getting our footing back on the ground and stabilizing. And that took some time. That definitely took some time. In the meantime, a couple of our grants had run their course, so we downsized a little bit, and we maintained, that structure for a period of time until, there were some things happening on various planes, and, we had a significant turnover with our board of directors in 2011. And that's when our founding mothers, we were, financially constrained because of some other things that were happening at that point in time. So the founding mothers got together with some other concerned community members, and they came back and rolled up their sleeves and really went to work. And what I have to say about that time span is the dedication and the commitment of this staff is so cohesive that it seemed like no matter what was going on during that tumultuous time, service provision did not skip a beat. They were out there doing their jobs, and there was a new finance manager that came in, and bless his soul, him and I were stepping into landmines, here, there, and everywhere. There were grants that hadn't been closed out. There was one grant that had been written that nobody even knew about. And, all these financial issues going on and things that needed to be cleaned up. So I think that he and I, at that point in time, we spent a whole entire year. I told him at one point, I feel like a firefighter. Like I need to put on my firefighting gear and my hip waders and just get out the hose and just, start putting out all these fires. But once all of that started to dissipate and the new board members came on board, there was again transformative change.
Do you feel the networking that you had done with these other issues you've talked about helped show support community-wise? Was that a positive factor that you had already reached out? Did that have any impact at all?
I believe that it did. I believe that it had some impact. But I think the community, by and large, with all the things that were happening, during that time frame before the new finance manager and I came on board, I think it kind of rocked their confidence in the organization. And I think that they saw this organization somewhat as a listing ship.
So the support of the founding mothers and you key staff people was what pulled through, got the ship back on course.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a coordinated team effort in and of itself. When I say that they came in and rolled up their sleeves, that's exactly what they did. And they hit the ground running. At that point in time, the Women's Center, when I came in with the new finance director and the new board was coming on, the Women's Center was, facing significant financial debt. And within a year's time, this board that came in was able to reduce that debt, I would say, by 2/3. And that trend has continued, and out of over $100,000 worth of debt, today where we sit, we have $5,000 left in that realm. So I think that speaks to the level of work and commitment that has gone on over the past couple of years. And I believe
and I have to say from the interviews, I'm interrupting, but that commitment comes from the belief in the mission.
Oh, absolutely.
And the people out there that need a women's center and a harbor house.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think the community ever stepped away from believing that this was a valued service. But they lost confidence, I believe, for a short period of time in the Women's Center's ability to be able to do that. But that's all been restored, and, support is coming out of the woodwork now, and I think we're in a firmer standing than we've been in a really long time.
That's wonderful.
A very long time. So the programming we have, our domestic violence programming has been really strong over the course of time with taking over the administration of the Harbor House. And that funding stream has been very stable over the years. There is more of an emphasis now on sexual assault program services. The Women's Center has had a VOCA grant funding for a couple of decades, and that has been our only source of sexual assault program funding. And back in 2010, there was an opportunity to apply for a sexual assault comprehensive services grant. And
Through the state again, or the national?
this is through the state, through the Domestic Violence and Prevention Treatment Board. So, I wrote that proposal. Didn't know if we stood a chance of, being awarded an allocation, but we were. So, since 2010, we have enhanced our sexual assault response programming, and our numbers have just about doubled in that respect. They have. When I think about this, domestic violence and sexual assault are of the most underreported crimes that you could, possibly think of. And
is that a cultural thing? Is that a law enforcement thing, or the assault victims?
I think it's a conglomeration of all of the above. With domestic violence, I'm a survivor myself, so I can speak from that perspective. There's shame involved in that whole thing. You feel inadequate. You feel, why is this happening to me? Why do I let this happen to me? There must be something, wrong with me. And survivors express that. And over the course of time, when you're emotionally and physically and abused, and, that abuse spans across multiple planes, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy comes about, because you have an offender telling you you're worthless, you mean absolutely nothing. And, that type of verbal abuse, that just goes on and on and on, and they say horrible things, and you start to believe that about yourself. So it really takes a lot of a wherewithal to pick up the phone and make a phone call, because people don't believe it by and large. How could that be even possible?
So women are living, and occasionally men, are living
Yes.
with that abuse, blaming themselves
Sure they
and not
are.
wanting
Sure
to
they
open.
are.
So that would account for a lot of underreporting.
It certainly would, and even within their own social structures, they may have family members who don't, believe it or buy into it, or make excuses for it, because it's just been a way of life for such a long time within that family structure. And then, you might reach out to another organization and might be talking to someone who doesn't understand the dynamics of domestic violence. And, there again, you're not believed. And it kind of shuts you down. When you reach out for help and you get shut down, you retreat.
So I guess from your remarks, your role working with victims, but also in educating the community. Does the Women's Center do that?
We certainly do, amongst the plethora of services that we provide. We advocate on behalf of survivors all the time. That includes children as well. With systems that, don't understand the dynamics of what they've been through and what they've experienced. We will sit next to them when they make a phone call if they need to reach out for assistance and they have gotten that type of response before. We will sit next to them and guide them through the process. And there are times when, in the beginning, we may even make that call for them with them sitting next to us. And our mission is to empower them to be able to do this on their own eventually at the end of the process. So it might start out, we make the phone call, and then the next time we're sitting next to them when they make that phone call. And then when they make the appointment, we go with them and sit there, with them while they're in the appointment, and then it just evolves from there. And our goal, like I said, is to empower them.
And your networking with other agencies gives you the opportunity to educate, and I'm sure there's back and forth education.
There is back and forth, and I'll share an experience that happened here the other day. I'll step back a little bit and then I'll talk about what happened the other day. Within the component of what happens at the Department of Human Services, Child Protective Services over the course of time, they have viewed domestic violence victims, back in the beginning of the process, as failing to protect their children. When they themselves, we had a totally different perspective about that. When you are being victimized to the degree where you're so caught up in just trying to survive, you have no control over. Survivors don't have any control over the abuse that's inflicted upon their children because they get it 20-fold. And working with other systems, these are the types of things that we really try to work on and focus on. And back in the day, women were being literally charged with failing to protect their children. there is still to this day an actual failure to protect charge, which would bring them into the courtroom and their name would end up on some central registry as if they were inflicting the abuse themselves. So being the advocate that I am, and the feminist that I am, and the belief that survivors have rights, I contacted the director of the Child Protective Services Department at that time when this was in full-fledged. And he and I began having conversations. And in the beginning of the conversations, we were not on the same page. But let that never be a deterrent. Let that never be a deterrent. So the conversations evolved, and the more I kept calling him, it evolved to the point where we sat down and had coffee about that, and we talked about it, and how is it that can even come about? Because I didn't understand it, and I was trying to understand how they could even come to that conclusion based on, what I know.
Failure to protect.
Failure to protect your children.
When
you have no control over that situation. So we sat down and, he went through the elements with me about what they take a look at when they respond to a situation. And what was gleaned from that whole conversation is, they had a scoring system that it was a point scoring system that gave the victim and the offender the exact same number of points when there was a domestic violence situation. Didn't matter if you were the victim, and you were the one being assaulted, or if you were the perpetrator inflicting the assault. Well, I didn't understand the fairness in that at all. So we had a lot of conversations about that. And what that resulted in is, I think, a mind shift. A mind shift. Because, what other conclusion can you draw? Right is right, right? Right.
And take into consideration.
Oh, absolutely. So we're not seeing that happen in our community anymore. And we have a very solid working relationship with the Child Protective Services Department here. I receive calls sometimes before the workers even go out on a complaint sometimes, wanting to, get some input about, we think there's domestic violence here. What do you think, what are your thoughts about this? And, give us some input about that. And I think that just speaks to the working relationships that we have established at this point in time.
Excellent.
Right.
A little aside, are those philosophies and cultural shifts making their way into training of social workers and counselors? And
Yes, they are. And what happened the other day is there is a network of shelter programs in the UP. And we get together, the directors of those programs get together on a quarterly basis. And one of the concerns that a couple of the other directors brought forth was the fact that in their community, there has been a resurgence of battered women being charged with failure to protect. And I said, oh, but wait a minute. This conversation was had maybe, 8, 10 years ago in this community, and here's where we've evolved in this community. So I picked up the phone, and I made a phone call to the, regional director of the Department of Human Services for the UP in Upper Lower Michigan, and he got on the speakerphone and addressed their concerns, and we started talking about a region-wide training for Child Protective Services workers to address these types of issues. So our staff does go out there. We do, rattle the bushes and the cages, and we are always, up for the challenge of providing that type of education.
And the necessity of that gets through these interviews, absolutely. Because people can't be expected to know or have these attitudes unless they've been enlightened to the changing culture.
And what happens, this resurges once in a while in our community as well, is, you have your partnerships all established and you're working really well together and you provided the educational pieces, and then there's a change of guard. And then the shift happens within another entity, and so then the training process starts over from square one. So it's an ongoing process, and we're up for the challenge.
Excellent, excellent. The other thing that's come through in the interviews is one of the reasons for the Women's Center doing the education, and one of the reasons for doing these interviews is the newer, younger folks
Mm-hmm.
may expect these more advanced and enlightened policies, but they don't know the history of how hard it's been to
Exactly.
achieve and how easy it could be to lose
Mm-hmm.
some of those advantages. Do you feel that way, that it's important that we get younger people?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that just speaks to, even in defining the word feminism, young women of today, as we're out there talking with Northern students and student groups and, conducting interviews if we have a position to fill, and we do ask that question. What does the word, feminist mean to you? What does that mean to you? And over the course of time, I myself have seen a change in how that's defined within the younger, women coming up.
What would be key in the difference, do you think?
What would be key in the difference? I think the whole women's movement and how that came about, and that really strong sense of what that word meant, and interwoven with equality and all of those things, I think some of those elements have dissipated and fallen by the wayside. So, and I think that, I don't know what they're teaching in, history classes about that whole movement, but there seemed to be some sort of a bit of a negative connotation attached to the word feminist as being bra-burning, feminazis and whatever have you. And I even found that when we were, a colleague of mine and I were going around, we actually went to police departments to, in the beginning of the process, to establish our collaborative network with them. We would just stop in and say, hi, here we are, do you have a few minutes for a cup of coffee? And, and transitioning through the process, it was, one from in Marquette, a police department, that said to us, well, here's, what we've operated for so many years. Of the women at the Women's Center, they're all part of that women's bra-burning movement, and a bunch of feminazis over there, and you don't like men, do you? Well, of course we do. And I'm not out there burning my bra. That's not what that word means. So I think the younger women of today, there's a little bit of that. Like I said, I'm not quite sure what's being taught in history classes, but they define, being a feminist as a little bit of a different thing than I think, some of us who have been around for a little bit longer.
For the most part, are they okay being associated? Or do they use a different term? Or?
I don't know that they're as comfortable calling themselves a feminist as, the older, those of us are. I think they would prefer, from what I understand from their viewpoint, they prefer to be called more, they're empowered. They're empowered women, which, in essence, it means the same thing. Right.
And if they're comfortable with that. And
absolutely.
Right. Okay, Phyllis, as we work toward the end of the interview, because you're right at the cutting edge now, what would be your view into the future, your hopes and wishes for our local Women's Center?
The Women's Center has, served in a leadership role in the progressive thinking realm for so many years. And I think our next task, I'm on a mission to, bring about conversations about traditional hierarchy and whether or not that fits within our organizational structure. And as it relates to, what is our mission and what is our vision and what are we here to do and what is our purpose here? And how does that all fit in? So
you'd like to revisit this, the board and staff together?
Absolutely.
Do you think that's about to happen?
I'm on a mission.
In process.
I am on a mission. I'm a little bit of a rebel. And, I have some personal feelings about traditional hierarchy and it not really fitting with the progressiveness of what happens here. Doesn't really fit with our mission, doesn't really fit with our vision, doesn't fit with the services that we provide. And it just so happens, I just completed a grant proposal, and our grant funders are actually starting to take a look at this as well. How does your organizational structure and how you operate, how does that integrate with your mission, vision, service provision practices and policies and all of that. So I think it's time to have that conversation.
We will be following this with great interest.
I'm excited about that. I like change.
Okay. Anything that we haven't had a chance, or you haven't had a chance to discuss any topic that you don't want to go undiscussed?
Nothing is really coming to mind. Nothing is coming to mind. Thank you so much for taking this task on, because I think that, you know, the Women's Center, the history is so rich and it needs to be preserved in some respect. And I think that all of these interviews are going to bring, you know, key elements about how things transitioned over the course of time.
Thank you, and thank you for your contributions all along the way there.
Oh, thank you so much.
Phylis Loonsfoot, current CEO, is that the proper title, or director?
Director.
Director of the Women's Center in Marquette, Michigan.
Thanks so much.
We got it.
Yay!